Today's lecture is about Thomas Jefferson and his slave Sally Hemings, and it's going to go into whether or not Jefferson had had children by Sally Hemings, and I'm going to make the case that he did. Now, that's not a unanimous opinion. Lots of historians think that that's perhaps not the case. So it's not really the point whether or not, in fact, he actually had kids with Sally Hemings. The point is rather that this tells us something about slavery, and it tells us something about the way slavery affected family life, and it affected the relations between the races in the South. So that's really what today's lecture is about. The rest of it, it's 200-year-old gossip. So let's look at it and get going. I'm going to start out with a DNA study that was done in 1998 of Jefferson's descendants, and the DNA study reignited the debate about whether Jefferson had fathered children by Sally Hemings. So we're going to take a quick look at that and what the DNA study tells us and what it doesn't tell us, because what it doesn't say is very important. Then I want to look at Martha Jefferson, Jefferson's wife, and her relationship with Sally Hemings, who was her slave. And then we're going to leave the Jefferson private life behind and talk about Jefferson the public man, because Jefferson the public man had some very interesting things to say about slavery, particularly in his book, Notes on the State of Virginia. Then we're going to look at slavery in actuality at Monticello, how it worked. Look at Sally Hemings' descendants and what happens to them. And finally, we're going to look at dinner at Monticello and what that might tell us about slavery in the American South. Themes today: Thomas Jefferson's home life shows a complex relationship with slavery that parallels his contradictory public stance on it. Jefferson was a complicated man, and by the way, I'm not trying to argue today that Jefferson wasn't a great man, because he was, but he was a complicated one, and he said contradictory things about slavery, had a deep, I think, internal division about slavery, and his private life reflects that too, I think. And then secondly, I want to make the argument that Jefferson is not unique. This is not just 200-year-old gossip. Looking at the Jefferson family, looking at Jefferson's relationship with slavery, reveals, I think, the internal contradictions and internal tensions of plantation slavery itself. All right, there's Jefferson, who's born in 1743, died in 1826, on July 4th, 1826, same day John Adams did, and was very, very important figure in American history. He was president. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was a leading advocate for religious toleration. Those are the things some of the things he's most proud of. He had a capacious mind, was interested in many, many things. He, as president, sponsored the Lewis and Clark expedition. He was interested in education. He was founder of the University of Virginia. He was a diplomat. He had been the ambassador to France. As we talked about in the previous lecture, he was a leader of a congressional faction when he was in Congress. He served as vice president. He has a justly very, very high place in American life. Here he is a little later in his life. He was redhead. He and was a Virginian, and all of that is going to be important as we go on today. All right. There's a background to the DNA study. And the DNA study is in part caused by an uproar about whether Jefferson has two families or not, a white one and one that comes through his slave, Sally Hemings. And one of the reasons that this debate was reignited had to do with the graveyard at Monticello, and that's a view of the graveyard at Monticello. Monticello, which means Little Mountain in Italian, was Jefferson's home, his plantation, and it's on a hill outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. It's kind of a world unto itself. Jefferson was very, very fond of Monticello and spent a lot of his time trying to make it a better place, and tinkered with it architecturally, and he did lots of his agricultural experiments up there, and he just adored Monticello, and that's where he's buried. And there's a family graveyard, and this is a view of it at Monticello. Now, this family graveyard is only open to the descendants of Thomas Jefferson, which raises the question, are the descendants of Sally Hemings also the descendants of Thomas Jefferson? And a group of these people, the Hemings side, claimed that they were descendants of Thomas Jefferson and therefore have a right to be buried in this graveyard. Very controversial. The legitimate descendants had big discussions about it, voted not to admit the Hemings descendants into the graveyard, and there the matter stood in the late 1990s. By the way, Jefferson designed his own grave. This is his drawing of his gravestone, and here it is in close-up, and you can see that he's got his proudest achievements on there. Being president wasn't one of them. Author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. So, can Sally Hemings' descendants be buried there? The answer was and is no, but that raised a few scientific questions after DNA became widely available as a tool in courts and as a way to study inheritance in average people. In 1998, Nature magazine commissioned a DNA study or published anyway, a DNA study comparing the descendants of Sally Hemings to the descendants of Thomas Jefferson. So what we see in this slide is a Jefferson family tree. Thomas Jefferson's in the second column to the right. He's a son of Peter Jefferson, and he married Martha Skelton. And there are Jefferson's children on to the right of that, and then more descendants, grandchildren to the far right. Okay, the DNA study only used Y chromosomes. So the problem with Jefferson, it was that he didn't have any living male descendants. You can see he had one son, and the son died as an infant in 1777. So there's no male line, no direct male line from Thomas Jefferson, which makes the DNA study a bit problematic. So what they did was test a couple of different DNA lines. They tested the DNA lines of Thomas Jefferson's uncle, Field Jefferson, which is not on this chart, and they compared that to the Hemingses. And they also tested some of the descendants of Thomas Jefferson's sister, Martha. You can see her. She lived from 1746 to 1811. She married a man named Carr, had two sons, Samuel and Peter Carr, and their descendants were tested as part of this DNA study as well. Okay, these were compared to the descendants of Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings had 6 children. Her oldest son was named Eston, her youngest son was named Eston. His descendants were tested, and she had another son named Thomas. His descendants were tested as well. Okay, so here's a chart of the test. Field Jefferson, Jefferson's uncle, his descendants are tested there on the left. And then Sally Hemings's children, Thomas and Eston's descendants, were tested there on the right. All right, what does this study tell us? Well, it had a couple of interesting conclusions. One is that Thomas Hemings's descendants, though there was a European bloodline, her son Thomas had a father of European descent. This father was apparently not a Jefferson. Sally became pregnant in Paris with Thomas when she was in her late teens. However, Eston Hemings's descendants, according to the study, carried the Jefferson DNA. Now, they carried Jefferson DNA. Whether it's the DNA of Thomas Jefferson is another story. And by the way, Eston Hemings was noted for his resemblance to President Thomas Jefferson in his lifetime. Eston was very, very light-skinned. In fact, he was a redhead and apparently looked a lot like Thomas Jefferson. Furthermore, Eston was one of only 5 of Jefferson's slaves freed at his death. Jefferson died in debt. Almost all of his slaves were sold to help pay that debt, and only 5 of them were freed. 2 of the other 5 were Eston's brothers, John and Madison, and all 5 were related to the Hemingses. All right, so we can't say for sure that the DNA study tells us anything about Thomas Jefferson. And a lot of the people who say that Jefferson was unlikely to be the father of Sally Hemings' children make sure to make that point, that some of Jefferson's relatives, perhaps his nephews, may have been, or cousins, may have been one of them may have been the father of Sally Hemings' children. How likely is that? Well, we've looked at a couple of other pieces of evidence I just told you about. The fact that Jefferson only freed Hemings' relatives in his will. The fact that Randolph, Thomas Jefferson's brother, lived 20 miles away, and though he had 2 sons who were not tested in the DNA study, or descendants were not tested in the DNA study, they were often considered possibly to be, one of them would possibly be the father of Sally Hemings' children. That's speculation about that in the past. They'd certainly have a very close DNA match with Jefferson. There's that to consider. But though Randolph was visiting Monticello 9 months before Eston's birth, on the other hand, Jefferson was there too, and Jefferson was also there 9 months before the births of every one of Sally Hemings' children. There were rumors at the time, we'll discuss them in a minute, that Jefferson was the father of his slave Sally's children. As early as the election of 1800, those rumors start to come out. And finally, there is an unbroken tradition in the Hemings family, in the descendants of Sally Hemings families, that Thomas Jefferson was the father of all of the children. So there's a lot of additional evidence that suggests that Thomas Jefferson fathered children by his slave. As the Nature magazine article concluded, the burden of proof has clearly shifted. Okay. So that's what we can say for sure. Let's go on and look at Jefferson's life. Sally Hemings was the slave of Thomas Jefferson's wife, and when Martha Jefferson married Thomas, Sally and many of her relatives came with Martha into the new household. So let's talk about Martha Jefferson a little bit. Martha, we don't really know much about. There's no portrait of Martha. We have no idea what she looked like. And there really aren't many mementos of Martha Jefferson. That pillow, which she apparently embroidered, is about it. So Martha's a little bit of a mystery in some ways. You can see that she married Thomas Jefferson in 1772 when she was 24 years old. She was a widow, by the way, a young widow, childless one. And she lived for 10 more years. She's only 34 when she died. The Jeffersons apparently had a very happy marriage, and that's certainly suggested by the level of grief that Thomas felt upon Martha's death. That's about all we know of Martha Jefferson. Here's another memento of hers, at least according to oral tradition. This is a bell of apparently Mrs. Jefferson's that she that descended in the Hemings family, so a kind of a souvenir of Martha, perhaps through the Hemings. Very little known about her. She was pregnant a lot. She had Martha in 1772, another Martha, Jane. Jane dies as an infant, the infant's son, Maria, who lived to adulthood, Lucy, who died as an infant, and another Lucy, who is born in 1782 and only lives to be a toddler. And this last pregnancy, this bottom Lucy E., is the pregnancy that kills off Martha Jefferson. Martha Jefferson Randolph was Thomas Jefferson's daughter, Martha. She later marries a man named Randolph. And at the time of her mother's death, she writes about her father's grief. I was his constant companion, a witness to many a violent outburst of grief. The violence of his emotion to this day I do not describe to myself. Let me read you an account of the death of Martha Jefferson. Martha Jefferson had this difficult birth with the second Lucy, and she was ill for quite some time. Lucy was born on May 8th, 1782, and it took until September 6th for Martha to die. So the entire course of the summer she's dying, and by the end she knew it. She was very, very sick and very, very weak. On September 6th, the day she died, she took out a pen and she copied a passage from one of her favorite books, the novel Tristram Shandy. This is how it goes. Time wastes too fast. Every letter I trace tells me with what rapidity life follows my pen. The days and hours of it are flying over our heads like clouds of a windy day, never to return. More, everything presses on. She was too weak to finish copying at that point, so Thomas Jefferson picked up the pen and completed the passage. Every time I kiss thy hand to bid adieu, every absence which follows it, are preludes to that eternal separation which we are shortly to make. And then he wrote on the paper, my dear wife died this day at 11:45 a.m. So Jefferson saved the paper the rest of his life. That's why we know about it. He goes into deep mourning. He has difficulty coming out of it, and writes later on to one of his friends that he was, quote, emerging from the stupor of mind which had rendered me as dead to the world as she whose loss occasioned to it. It took him 2 months to be able to write that letter. So he has a very, very difficult time, very sad. And there's a story that he promised his wife on his deathbed that he would not remarry. And here's that story. This comes down to us from one of his employees, a white man, who heard the story secondhand. The house servants were Betty Brown, Sally Critta, and Betty Hemmings, Nance and Ursula. They were old family servants and great favorites. By the way, Betty Hemmings was Sally Hemings' mother. They were in the room when Mrs. Jefferson died. Sally was one of Mrs. Jefferson's servants, and they were very close. So she's there at the deathbed. She died before I went to live with him and left 4 little children. He never married again. They have often told my wife that when Mrs. Jefferson died, they stood around the bed. Mr. Jefferson sat by her and she gave him directions about a good many things that she wanted done. When she came to the children, she wept and could not speak for some time. Finally, she held up her hand and spreading out her 4 fingers, she told him she could not die happy if she thought her 4 children were ever to have a stepmother brought in over them. Holding her other hand in his, Mr. Jefferson promised her solemnly that he would never marry again, and he never did. He was then quite a young man and very handsome, and I suppose he could have married well, but he always kept his promise. So there is that testimony. In any case, Thomas Jefferson never marries again, and that leads us to Sally. This is the only record we have of Thomas Jefferson's that he had anything to do with Sally Hemings. It's a page from his farm book, probably in 1816. It's in his handwriting, and it's a list of his slaves. And there at the bottom you can see his slave Sally, and underneath that he's got listed Harriet, Madison, and Eston. Harriet, Madison, and Eston were children of Sally Hemings's. So that's it as far as the record goes of Jefferson and Sally knowing each other. Sally had come to Paris as the companion to one of Jefferson's daughters in 1798. I'm sorry, 1789. That's where they lived, and Jefferson had Sally's brother trained to be a chef while they were in Paris. He's one of the finest chefs in America, trained in the French tradition. And Jefferson was famous for his dinners at Monticello, which we'll talk about later. And James Heming, Sally's brother, was the chef. So Sally's in Paris too. As I said, she's a teenager. She's 18 years old. She gets pregnant while she's there, and her first baby is a result of that pregnancy. All the rest of her pregnancies happened at Monticello. Sally Hemings, we don't know anything about what she looked like, but we have a couple of descriptions of her from people who were at Monticello. One is a slave at Monticello. This is Isaac Jefferson, who's photographed in 1845, long after Jefferson's death and long after he'd left Monticello. And he describes her as mighty near white, very handsome, long straight hair down her back. Thomas Jefferson Randolph, Jefferson's grandson, Martha Jefferson Randolph's son, described her as light-colored and decidedly good-looking. Now, Sally Hemings had a white father, and it's not clear whether her mother was entirely of African descent. Probably not. So Sally Hemings is probably 3/4 white, which accounts for the light skin and the straight hair. All right, here are the children of Sally Hemings. Thomas, the one born in 1790, conceived in Paris. Harriet, Beverly, who's male, an unnamed daughter died. Another Harriet, who lives to adulthood, and then Madison and Eston. Now, this second Harriet, the one who lived, was born in 1801, was freed when she was 21 in 1822, before the death of Jefferson. This, again, is his overseer speaking about this. He freed one girl some years before he died. And there was a great deal of talk about it. She was nearly as white as anybody and very beautiful. People said he freed her because she was his own daughter. This guy says he wasn't. She was not his daughter, she was Blank's daughter. I know that. I have seen him come out of her mother's room many a morning when I went up to Monticello very early. This guy's name was Edmund Bacon, and he was the chief overseer in Monticello for 20 years. So the stories that Harriet Hemings was Thomas Jefferson's daughter, this guy says no, but on the other hand, she's one of the very, very few slaves freed. Now, if Mr. Bacon had actually named names, we might have another suspect to do a DNA study on, but we don't. He goes on. When she was nearly grown, by Mr. Jefferson's direction, I paid her stage fare to Philadelphia and gave her $50. I've never seen her since and don't know what became of her. He says while she was on the plantation, she never did any hard work. So the Jefferson definitely favors the Hemings family. His chefs are Hemings. Sally always worked in the house. Her children were definitely favored. They were freed before other people, and they did less work. Now, the first rumor about Thomas and Sally becomes public in 1802. It's published in this paper called the Richmond Recorder by a guy named James Callender, who wrote, and you can see the quotation here, Jefferson keeps and for many years has kept as his concubine one of his slaves. Her name is Sally. Now, this guy, James Callender, had a grudge against Thomas Jefferson. He had a political grudge, and this rumor for many years is thought purely to be a result of this ill will on the part of Callender. On the other hand, Callender also accused Jefferson of attempting to seduce a married woman, and Jefferson later admitted to that. He never admitted to any kind of relationship with his slave Sally, maybe because it was politically impossible to do so, or maybe because it wasn't true. We don't know. All right, that's all the gossip. Now let's get to Jefferson's public statements on slavery. And the public man had some very, very interesting things to say about it. Jefferson, as you probably know, was the author of the Declaration of Independence, the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence went through a number of drafts. He wrote it as part of a committee. The committee made some changes before it presented it to the Continental Congress. By the way, Benjamin Franklin was on that committee. In the first draft of the Declaration, Jefferson attacks slavery. And he attacks slavery by attacking, as part of his attack on King George. For one thing, the Declaration has this passage: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed with their Creator with inherent and inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's in the right at the beginning of the Declaration. And that passage is later emphasized by American abolitionists. That idea that all men are created equal, they say is implicitly an attack on slavery. But Jefferson gets much more specific as well. And this is stuff that's taken out in later versions of the Declaration. He, quoting Jefferson here, George III, has waged a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in transportation thither. This piratical warfare is the warfare of the supposedly Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. So he blames the king for slavery and says all of these bad things about the institution of slavery. Jefferson was anti-slavery as a young man, and in his very earliest career in the Virginia House of Burgesses, the House of Representatives in Virginia, attacked slavery there too. So he makes this anti-slavery statement in the Declaration, and then he's back in Revolutionary Virginia when he's governor of Virginia. There's the Committee for the Declaration of Independence. John Adams was on it, as well as Benjamin Franklin. Jefferson goes back to Virginia during the Revolution, serves as governor, and claims to continue his attacks on slavery. This is what he said in his autobiography. It was thought better that a plan for future and general emancipation of slaves should be kept back and attempted only by way of amendment. The principles of the amendment, however, were agreed upon, that is to say, the freedom of all born after a certain day and deportation at a proper age. But it was found that the public would not yet bear such a proposition, nor will it bear it even to this day. Yet the day is not distant when it must bear and adopt it, or much worse will follow. Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free. Jefferson's a big reformer in Virginia. He wants to reform courts. He designs a new building. He wants to reform inheritance laws. He wants to end the death penalty. He wants to reform the education system. He writes the statute on religious freedom he's so proud of that he puts on his gravestone. And slavery is one of these things. But slavery is an exception. Slavery says society isn't ready for it, and we're going to have to back away from it. But in addition, Jefferson imposes a condition on ending slavery. I'll read that to you again. The freedom of all born after a certain day, and deportation after a certain age. So he wants everybody, slavery to end slowly, with the children born after a certain day freed, but not necessarily slaves who are already slaves. And he always links that to the idea of deportation. This is what he goes on to say about that. Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free, and nor is it less certain that the two races, equally free, cannot live in the same government. Nature, habit, and opinion have drawn indelible lines of distinction between them. It is still in our power to direct the process of emancipation and deportation peaceably, and in such slow degree that the evil will wear off insensibly. If, on the contrary, it is left to force itself on, human nature must shudder at the prospect held up. Well, this is really interesting because Jefferson here is saying that there are two races, and these two races have to remain separate. They cannot mix. It's too dangerous, and so forth and so on. Now, whether or not he himself was fathering children by Sally Heming, the fact remains that somebody white, somebody in Jefferson's family, was fathering those children. So Jefferson's surrounded in his home, his entire adult life, by mixed-race children who were slaves. So the idea that somehow these races are concretely defined and must remain separate is belied by his own family life. It's a fascinating idea that he's got this notion that slaves have to be deported because otherwise it's going to be disaster. while he's doing this, Jefferson is also highly conscious of the evils of slavery and the dangers of slavery. Very, very late in his life, he's an old man in 1820, at the time of the Missouri Compromise, and which scared him to death. Jefferson wrote about the Missouri Compromise that he feared. I'll quote him here. "We've never had so ominous a question. I thank God I shall not live to witness its issue." What does he think is going to happen? He fears the development of what he calls confederacies, rival confederacies in America, and a civil war. He also compared slavery, as continuing slavery as an institution, to holding a wolf by the ears. In other words, you can't let go, but you can't hang on to it either. It's this horrible dilemma. So Jefferson knew that slavery was a disaster for America. He knew it was an evil, but he also believed that it was very difficult to end, and more importantly, he believed that the only way to end it was to separate the races. Let's take a look now at his book, The Notes on the State of Virginia, because these same themes come through in that even more eloquently. When he was in France, he was asked a lot of questions about Virginia, and he decided that he would answer these questions by writing notes about Virginia, and eventually publishes them as this book, Notes on the State of Virginia. He doesn't want to talk about something that very much interests the French, and that is slavery. This is what he writes about that. "The strictures on slavery and on the Constitution in Virginia are the parts I do not wish to have made public, at least till I know whether their publication would do harm or good. It is possible in my own country these strictures might produce an irritation," as is any kind of attack on slavery or suggestion that slavery should end, "that these strictures might produce an irritation which would indispose the people towards emancipation of their slaves." So Jefferson's saying that white people in Virginia don't want to free slaves. The time isn't right to bring up the subject. It's going to alienate them, and so forth and so on. But that begs the question, when would the right time be? And the answer from Jefferson is never. His entire life he's making the same excuse. Slavery's a bad thing, but we can't end it yet. Now, in the notes, he says all sorts of interesting things about slavery. Some of them pretty horrendous, and some of them actually quite moving and eloquent. This dual mind of Jefferson about slavery is never more apparent than in the notes. Here he is talking again about the problem of ending slavery. "It will probably be asked, why not retain and incorporate the blacks into the state and thus save the expense of supplying, by importation of white settlers, the vacancies the slaves will leave? And here's his answer. Why it's impossible to just free people and let them keep living there. Deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites. 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained. New provocations. The real distinctions which nature has made. He thinks races are biologically different. And many other circumstances will divide us into parties and produce convulsions which will probably never end, but in the extermination of one or the other race. To these objections, which are political, may be added others which are physical and moral." And then he goes into this long pseudoscientific description of what he thinks are the physical differences between the races. And once again, I'll point out that Jefferson lives in a household full of mixed race, full of it, mixed race people. So the idea that the races are somehow separate and can't be mixed in any way is a completely phony idea on the basis of his own experience. It's very, very odd. All right, here he is about the moral effects of slavery. There must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. He's saying slavery is bad for white people. Here's why. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions. the most unremitting despotism on the one part and degrading submissions on the other. He knows slavery. He lives it every day. Our children see this and learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal. The parent storms, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, puts on the same airs in the circle of smaller slaves, gives loose to his worst passions, and thus nursed, educated, and daily exercised by tyranny, cannot but be stamped by it with odious peculiarities. The man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances. One half the citizens trample on the rights of the other, transform those into despots and these into enemies, destroys the morals of one part and the patriotism of the other. For if a slave can have a country in this world, it must be any other in preference to that which he is born to live and labor for another. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and that his justice cannot sleep forever. So Jefferson understood everything wrong with slavery, but he couldn't bring himself to call for its end. He claimed this was for political reasons, but he also had this notion that the races had to be separated. We had to have this clean break, and that all people of African descent had to be deported. That's a ridiculously impossible requirement. So his desire to end slavery is tied to this requirement that makes the end of slavery impossible. And he lived his whole life with that contradictory public opinion.